Thank you all for inviting me to this very special day, and I'd like to start with acknowledging the traditional lands upon which we stand. Western University is located in close proximity to the 3 vibrant local First Nations who have had long-standing relationships with the land and the place that we now recognize as London, Ontario. These are the Chippewas of the Thames First Nation, who are part of the Anishinaabe Nation, the Oneida Nation of the Thames, who are part of the Haudenosaunee Six Nations, and the Munsee Delaware Nation, who are part of the Lenni Lenape Nation. And historically, we also remember the Attawandaron neutral peoples who once settled along this region alongside the Algonquin and Haudenosaunee peoples and used this land as their traditional beaver hunting grounds. So I begin with that acknowledgement of the traditional lands. And now I'd like to just say a few words about Robert Macmillan. I have a very special place in my heart for Dr. Macmillan. He was the Associate Dean of the graduate program when I was here, or I was here when he was the Associate Dean of the graduate program. And the one thing that I remember so clearly and experienced in such a profoundly personal way was his kindness and his gentleness and his generosity of spirit. And I might get a little choked up talking about this, and Catherine's going to know why, because she's heard me talk about this before. But in 2010, I became very ill. And this is a bit relevant for the talk today, because I came ill not solely, but partly because of the amount of work I had. I was completely overwhelmed and stretched way too thin and got very, very sick. I got so sick to the point that I was hospitalized. I ended up having an 18-month medical leave. But the one thing that I wanted to keep doing, despite being in the hospital, despite being very, very ill, was to keep teaching, because teaching is my love. And I felt that if I could keep teaching, that would enable me to get better. And I didn't, and Dr. Macmillan was so kind that even though I was so sick, he agreed that we could run my favorite graduate course after in the regular evening hours, and if I couldn't come to any class, he would teach it for me. On his own time, without having the background or anything, he agreed to make that possible for me. And it was such an act of kindness and grace that I'll never forget that. I did come in to teach most of the classes, and some I couldn't, and he was there. He was there. So I do remember him, and I will never forget that graciousness and that kindness to me. Okay, so on to my talk. I realize the mouse is, there is no mouse. Oh darn it, I'm gonna have to do a little bit of walking back and forth. I can help. You can help? Sure. Anyway, I'm talking today about creativity in educational research. I'm gonna let you do it.
Advance. Yeah, just tell me when to advance.
Okay, advance. Oh, you have one. What are you doing hiding the clicker? Good, I can use that then.
And then you just plug in USB.
Oh, that's awesome. Wow, okay, so now it's on.
Okay, are we all ready to go? We'll see, let's test it.
Where's the USB?
Oh, it's in the back.
Oh, it's in. I am not very okay. Is this?
We'll get this sorted out.
So you have to plug that in and then turn that on.
Okay, so I'm gonna.
Why don't we just move to the next slide while we get that sorted out? This is great. This is exactly what we want to be talking about. All right, so here's an outline of what I'm going to be talking about today. I'm going to start by talking about the popularity about discourses of creativity, and especially around discourse of creativity and innovation with respect to policy making, and some reference to educational policy making. Then I want to walk you through some of the standard common theories of creativity, drawing upon psychological and sociological literature, and ending up with discussing the economic emphasis on creativity that we really see prevalent in today's current discourses around creativity. I'm going to talk about the implications of that discourse and how the economic angle, the economic bent, the economic emphasis on creativity tames or domesticates creativity. It takes away what we call the transgressive nature and the risk-taking nature of creativity, which I think is something we need to reclaim in educational circles and our educational research. I'm going to talk about some of the trends, very briefly, around the corporatization of higher education and how those trends, how those reforms make being creative in our work, in our research, very difficult, if not impossible. But don't despair. it's not just a totally negative message. I'm going to shift then and talk about the possibilities for creativity in our research and what are the ways that we can think about and become creative educational researchers. So that's kind of the structure of my presentation. I hope you enjoy it, and I think hopefully there'll be some time at the end for some questions. So there's lots of talk about creativity. I don't know if you follow any of this, but we have many, many books about how to be creative that are out there. There's one on the slide there. There's lots of different associations. I came across one yesterday in putting together the final touches to the PowerPoint slide. It's a Creative Cities of Canada website. And I can make these PowerPoint slides available for you after if you like. So you can click on the links and see. I won't go through all of them right now, but it's all about how we can mobilize cities to become more creative. More on that in a moment. And we have lots of emphasis and policies around creativity and education. So I just have one up here from the United States, reinvesting in arts education, winning America's future through creative schools. In Obama's Commission on the Arts and Humanities report that was released in 2012, they outline, and this is a part of that strategy that I just mentioned, the powerful role that arts education can play in developing creativity and innovation. Keep that word innovation in your mind. I'm going to come back to it. So we see this notion of creativity being taken up in many policy circles, and as you've heard, the sort of theme of today's session, symposium is around the local and the global, and we see the creativity discourse clearly played out at all levels, from the local right down, from the global to the local. So I have up here a few examples from the United Nations. This was a report that was issued in 2008, which they talk about the creative economy. UNESCO, in their 2012 report, which was, they have a chapter all about creativity. It's a report that summarizes the work that UNESCO has done over the course of the year. And in that report, again, they make reference to the importance and significance of creativity and innovation. And then the other example I have here is from Australia, but I could have pulled examples from nearly every country, at least the ones that I could read in the English language, that would have a similar kind of government strategy around creativity. But what do you notice here about the quotes that I have up there? Is there something that stands out, something in red? What is it? What is it? Anybody? The economy, right. So it's this inextricable link between creativity and economic growth and economic productivity. That is very clearly the connection that we see in these policies and the popular discourses around creativity. So let's step away from that for a moment and let's ask ourselves, well, what is creativity? What do researchers say? What have researchers said about creativity? What do we know about creativity and the creative process? Well, you have heard this many times, I'm sure, with your research, and that is you try and define something, and you just want to have the definition. And you say to your supervisor, I just want the one right definition, the definition of internationalization, the definition of equity, the definition of I don't know, you fill in the blank, whatever. And they say, well, it's contested. There are many different definitions, there's many different perspectives, as is the case with creativity here. So one way of thinking about creativity, a pretty common way of thinking about creativity, is that generally it has to do with synthesizing things that don't normally go together, and new combinations of ideas, of thoughts, of a product with an idea, a topic with a different kind of theory, and the creation of something new that hasn't been created before. And Poincaré, who wrote about creativity, called it an act of the subliminal self, which is capable of discernment. It knows how to choose, and it's being able to choose and make those connections in ways that are innovative, new, and lead to breakthroughs in our thinking. And it's a very imaginative process as well. So what are the theories around creativity? I'm going to simplify here, and with all due respect for those who or have done any research around creativity, it's a very brief synopsis of a very large body of research that's out there. But we can generally break down the research on creativity into 4 different sets or areas. One is the products approach. Another is what they call the people or the personality approach, focusing on the individual characteristics of the creative person. The third is what they call the processes approach, and that is what are the processes that lead to creativity, to creative moments and breakthroughs. And then the economic approach, again, the one that is the most dominant today. So the products perspective is really looking at the products that are produced through creativity. And there's researchers in this field who adopt this paradigm attempt to count, evaluate, judge the creative products in different disciplines or fields. So for example, in music, there'll be a different way of understanding creativity and a different measure or product, a piece of music, for example. In the work we do, it might be a book, a chapter, a thesis. Those are the different products that stem from creativity. And the researchers who adopt this approach use what's called a psychometric approach to creativity. The personality perspective is quite popular, and again, as I just mentioned, it has to do with some of the characteristics that are considered that creative people are supposed to have. So the researchers in this area have studied people that are considered creative in a variety of different domains, done interviews, surveys, etc. With them, and come up with a generally accepted list of characteristics and traits and tendencies or intellectual habits associated with creativity. I'm not going to read them all. You can see some of the list here. What's interesting is there's often a dichotomy. Smart yet naive, disciplined yet playful. So it's not always one or the other. One of the key people who does research in this area has a name that's almost impossible to announce. I've got the phonetics here. Mihai Csikszentmihalyi. Csikszentmihalyi?
Mihai Csikszentmihalyi.
Csikszentmihalyi. Thank you, Pam. That's great. This is based on a lot of his research. He's a very prolific writer in the field of creativity, and you can see them up there. We also, did I go backwards? What did I do? Cognitive processes perspective. This is the body of research that's focusing on the processes associated with creativity. And again, there's been a lot of research going back to Wallace, and I think Wallace was writing in the 1920s, yes, in a book called The Art of Thought. So we have many decades of research around the creative process. The stages here, some people add a sub-stage and add other stages, but it's generally accepted that you'll have one stage which involves preparation, consciously studying a task, whatever it is that you're working on, that you're studying and working over. And doing that in a logical, pretty standard way. Standard as accepted by the field of study or discipline or area in which you work. Incubation is the period when the conscious and the unconscious mind is kind of mulling over things. Just kind of thinking through things, thoughts are going in and out. It's kind of defined as a mystical stage. It's very abstract. Wallace said it's sometimes described as being colored by a slight feeling of discomfort arising from a sense of separation from one's accustomed self. Anybody felt that? I felt that in my research sometimes. Yeah, it's scary. You know you're going somewhere, but you can't quite pin it down yet. The illumination, well, that's the eureka stage. It's when the light bulb goes on. Those are the best moments of all, especially when you're a researcher. But that is when the light goes on. You've got the new idea, and there's a sense of excitement around it. And verification, that's when you want to sort of go back to some of the processes associated with the preparation stage and work through very carefully verifying that idea. Drawing upon other research, if it's a problem you're trying to solve that problem, find the answer, and so on and so forth. So those are a set of different approaches for studying and understanding creativity, but there are limits to those approaches, in particular the personality and the process approaches. They're useful, they help us understand something, but they don't really explain, they simplify things in a way, especially the process approach. And in some ways they are based on the notion of prediction. In other words, if we can see that an individual has these characteristics, we can predict that they will be creative. If somebody follows these steps, in a way, we can predict. So there's a predictive assumption between these, underneath these approaches. They don't really tell us what creativity is. And for that, we need to turn to some other research. The social processes research defines creativity as judgments based on criteria that change from domain to domain, culture to culture, and over time. So creativity is not simply an attribute of individuals or a set of steps that individuals take, but it's a set of judgments that are made in particular domains, again, over time and in different places. There is a relatively new body of research that looks at how creativity is understood differently in different cultures. And some of the, what I've read is around sort of specifically around China, and the notions of creativity are different from the West. And I'm sure there's other research out there about other cultures as well. We could also look at how creativity, what is understood to be creativity, changes over time. And the example of painting is the best. Because Rembrandt's work, Rembrandt was not considered a great artist, and nor were and are many artists while they live, unfortunately. It is not until after they die, and there are art historians who can reinterpret the significance of their work in light of the changing trends in art, and in light of of reevaluating our understandings of the production of paintings. In this case, you could look at music as another example. And then Rembrandt is seen as being one of the most creative painters that we've ever had in the world. And so, but he wasn't at the time. So creativity changes. It's a relative notion, and the social processes research helps us to understand that. And I think it's a very important point to make and understand, especially when we do research. We tend to want to just look at the most recent research, but sometimes if we go back, sometimes decades, in looking at ideas in our field, we will find golden nuggets that nobody else thought were important in our area. And it's about rediscovering those and rediscovering the significance of them. Well, I did mention, and I'm going to go back to this notion of economic theories of creativity, which really dominate policy making today in so many different levels. They're focused on three different aspects: the impact of creativity on economic growth, models, economic methods of modeling markets for creativity, and how you can maximize economic creativity, what you can do to make your city, for example, creative in order to become economically more dynamic. And Mark Runco and Daniel Rubinson have described what they call a psychoeconomic model of creativity. And in this model, creativity is a product of investments in creativity. It's a very rational, technical approach to creativity. And they outline the costs and benefits of creativity for individuals, for cities, for countries, provinces, and so on and so forth. And this approach has been criticized for being very utilitarian. It sees creativity in terms of its usefulness. And its usefulness is defined in very practical, monetary ways primarily. One of the key people associated with the economic ideas of creativity is Richard Florida. And this book came out, I can't believe it, 2002. It felt like this is one of the reasons I started getting interested in this. I read this when it came out. Richard Florida, who's now based in Toronto at, I think, Ryerson, is he based at Ryerson? He wrote this book called The Rise of the Creative Force. The creative class, sorry. And he argues in his book that we have shifted from the industrial age to the creative economy age, where what is valued is human creativity, innovation, and knowledge. And he makes an argument that cities that are able to tap into creativity and innovation in the people who live within that city, those cities will be more economically viable than those who are not. He gets lots of money for going around the world making speeches about this, and cities seem to think, many municipal governments bring him in to try and find the answers for dealing with lagging economies in their cities by developing a creative class. So this discourse about the new creative economy has a history as well. It's emerged over a number of decades. It really goes back to Drucker's work around the knowledge society. And some of you might be familiar with his work. He was one of the earliest proponents of the claim that we have moved from an industrial-based society to a knowledge-based society. The new main means of production are knowledge-based. And since then, there has been this shift in a discourse from what we have previously thought of as an industrial, well, first agricultural society, to industrial society, to a new knowledge-based society. There's lots of different terms that are used. You can see them up here: knowledge, new knowledge economy, creative economy, new creative economy, information age. All those kinds of things alert us to the significance and importance of knowledge and creativity as a part of the knowledge-making process in our economy. But I and others would argue that the way that creativity has been understood and taken up, this economic, utilitarian version of creativity, is dangerous in a way. And what it does is it tames or co-ops or can't think of the other word right now. It tames and co-ops the transgressive and risk-taking notion of creativity. Two Australian researchers, Hay and Capites, in their critical account of Queensland. Queensland is a state in Australia that, like many states, has come up with a creativity policy, and they had a smart state strategy, and they analyzed that strategy, and they conclude in their research that the way creativity is framed is no longer as an atypical and frequently transgressive phenomenon. Rather, of necessity, it must be mainstreamed and domesticated, that's the word I was looking for, as a mundane activity, attitude, and capacity in which individual citizens become self-investing and self-managing subjects through ethical work of self-discipline and self-surveillance. So we see creativity being used in order to discipline individuals to become self-governing in how they go about doing their work and producing knowledge in this case. So they're drawing on one of my favorite researchers, you know who he is, Foucault, to make this argument. And I think it's a very important argument to make, and a very important argument to be thinking about in the context of educational research and the work that we do in higher education. So let's move now and talk a little bit about what does all of this mean for education. Well, we have a variety of education reforms that have been taken up globally. They are largely considered a part of a neoliberal agenda around education. We can think of examples of standardized testing, performance appraisals, the focus on measurable and practical outcomes, and we see it at all levels of education, not just at higher education. We see it clearly in all levels of education. And I'm a bit of a critic of these standardized tests, as you can well imagine. So it came as quite a surprise to me to hear that my son, who's in grade 3, can't wait to write the EQAO math test. I've been shocked and appalled about. But so there you go, complications. It's not as quite as simple as we might think at first. Anyway, and what does this look like in higher education? Well, what we have up on this slide are a set of, again, what are considered neoliberal reforms in higher education that have influenced higher education institutions to different degrees across different contexts. But we certainly see it here at Western. It's not as if we are immune from these. Other people refer to these as reforms around corporateizing the university. So when you have to fill out, with all due respect, Pam, your progress reports on your PhD progress, that is a form of accountability. That is a form of accountability so that your supervisor and the graduate office has a piece of paper that can document your progress or lack of progress and follow up on it, right? So that's an added piece. We didn't use, when we have lots of those examples today. We have to do that as faculty all the time. When you evaluate faculty at the end of a course, those performance appraisals are used to assess faculty in their teaching for their performance reviews every year. We get points. We get points for our teaching, we get points for our research, and points for our service. It's all numerical, and the key here is what can be measured that counts. Now I know there is a shift, and this is with all due respect to those people, even like myself, who work on those committees to assess my peers and colleagues, to look at the more qualitative measures. But generally speaking, with these kinds of reforms, what can't be measured doesn't count. It's about measurable outcomes. And this is related then, on a larger level, to the emphasis around ranking universities, and we can even think about ranking in how individuals are ranked. We don't talk about that so much. So what then are the implications for educational research? Again, what kind of research is valued? What kind of research is funded? Well, you know, when you apply for research grants, it's all about demonstrating measurable outcomes. And being able to include those in your research grants. So your research has to have outcomes that you can measure before the end of the grant period, because you'll need to write a report to indicate what you've done, the impact that you've had on your research. In countries like the UK, they have a very broad research framework. The Research Excellence Framework in the UK, which I believe has gone through quite a few revisions since, and I don't even think it's called the Research Excellence Framework anymore. They used to talk about not funding pointless research. Certain research got certain number of points, and other research didn't. And so research that didn't get the points, pointless research, would not be funded at all. And this leads to what Jane Kenway and Fahy talk about as the compliant research imagination. We end up complying to these expectations from the funding agencies and other levels of accountability in order to do research that is perhaps less creative than it might be otherwise. And these kind of reforms and ideas shape us as researchers in back to the ideas that I mentioned earlier, in ways to make us self-governed and self-disciplined in terms of the research that we do. Did I miss a slide? Oh yeah, I want to go back there. The other thing that I want to talk about is very real for all of us, and that is the impact of work intensification on our ability to do research and to do our research in the ways that we would like to. I see Pam nodding here. And the work intensification and the ways that we work, and that means multitasking a lot, doing many things at the same time, make it difficult for us to be able to engage in the creative process, particularly those stages that I mentioned earlier around the mulling and the brooding and the thinking and the reflecting in a quiet time, in a quiet place, and being mentally relaxed when we have multiple demands on our time. And those demands might not only stem from the academic context in which we work. We have to also understand we don't live in a bubble. We have demands that come to us in our personal lives, social lives, and so on and so forth. And those all make it very difficult to engage in the creative process. So the environment that I think that we live within in higher education today, I think it's a very difficult environment, and I'm not going to argue an impossible environment, but a difficult environment to engage in creativity in our research. All right. So let's shift the discourse a little bit, and we know the problems, we know the limits, we know the challenges that we face in higher education around being creative with our research. What are some of the possibilities? In the last part of the presentation, I want to walk you through a number of ideas that I have come up with based on my reading and the research and my own experience. You can see them listed up here, and I'll walk you through them one by one, starting with the idea of finding a conducive place to do our research. So back to that, the slide 2 before, about how the environments that we find ourselves in make it difficult to do our research. Creativity researchers have shown that the environments, the places where creativity flourishes are those that are both stable enough to allow for a continuity of effort, but also diverse, open, and flexible enough, to foster creativity in all of its forms. So you need to have a place where you have a sense of stability. Chaos around you is not going to be helpful at all. Like, it'll come back on the next slide. You need to have the stability in your workplace, wherever it is that you do your research. But you also need to have that openness and that flexibility that's possible within the environment where you work. Some people talk about the notion of getting out of life. And when I did my doctoral studies in London, England, near, I don't know if any of you know Russell Square, that area there. Anyway, my doctoral supervisor would say, when I was stuck, go for a walk in Russell Square, go to the British Museum and walk around, do something completely unrelated to your research. Get out of life. Get out of the life of the researcher and just forget about what you're doing. And in those moments, in those times, in those experiences, when I did that, I had probably my most eureka moments for my thesis. Slow down. I love Facebook. I get so many of my great news items on Facebook these days. So this was posted 2 days ago by a Facebook friend of mine. It's a new book that's just come out by 2 Canadian professors called The Slow Professor, Changing the Culture of Speed in Academia. Maggie Byrne and Barbara Sieber, they apply the principles of the slow movement. Hands up those of you who have heard of that. You know what I'm talking about. It's usually, it started with the slow food movement, and that is that, you take the time in cooking and enjoying it and eating it, and you really slow things down with the whole process around preparing and consuming food and with others. And there's restaurants that have like labels on their doors that they're part of the slow food movement restaurants, and you don't expect to get a meal in a hurry when you go into those restaurants, because that's not the point of it all. Anyway, so they were part of, one of them's at Brock University, I can't remember where the other is, and they were very concerned about these reforms to do with the corporatization of the university, work intensification, didn't have time to do anything, rushing here, rushing there. And I think what they have to say, although they're writing this book for professors, is applicable for graduate students too, absolutely. And so they decided to take these ideas from the slow movement and apply them to the work of professors. And they talk about how professors feel beleaguered, managed, frantic, stressed, and demoralized as they juggle the increasingly complex expectations of students, administration, and colleagues. Distractedness and fragmentation characterize academic life. And they argue in their book that professors, and you as students, well, at least I'm saying as you as students, need to slow it down. Devote more time to doing nothing. You don't want to do that. Everybody is in a race. We all want to get things done fast. But when you slow it down, and you actually make time to do absolutely nothing, you could be more effective in the long run. And that message is really, really hard to get across. They talk about how doing nothing allows us to enjoy more pleasure in the work that we do and our teaching, and it will enable us to take back the intellectual life that was once a part of the university. And so I think that's an important, important message. I'm going to talk about another sort of intervention here. You know, earlier I said that the Research Excellence Framework in the UK won't fund pointless research. And so I want to be a little provocative here and actually argue that we do need to engage in pointless research. Not for everybody. This quote comes from G.H. Hardy, who is an English mathematician who made leading contributions in analysis and number theory and was a Nobel Prize winner. And he said, "I've never done anything useful. No discovery of mine has made or is likely to make, for good or ill, the least difference in the amenity of the world. Judged by all practical standards, the value of my mathematical life is nil. And outside mathematics is trivial anyhow. I've just one chance of escaping the verdict of complete triviality, that I may be judged to have created something worth creating. And that I have created something is undeniable. The question is about his value." And he did get the credit for what he did, but he didn't start off trying to create something of practical value. That wasn't the initial motivation for what he was doing. Einstein, what can I say? One of the most famous quotes that came from Einstein is he talked about absurdity of ideas and sort of engaging with ideas that would seem like crazy, absurd, nobody else would want to. And he said, if those ideas aren't absurd at first, then there's no hope for them at all. That being said, if you recall back on the slide when I talked about the qualities of a creative person, it is generally accepted that creative people aren't people who just do anything here and there without any structure in their lives and sort of flit from idea to idea. They are, for the most part, well, I think nearly all the research would agree, they know their field and discipline very clearly. So that might be, if you're painting, you know the tradition in which you're working. If you're a musician, then you know that tradition and what has come before, what are the current cutting edge, I don't know, ways that jazz musicians in your area and your field work. And if you're a researcher on special education needs of children in the mathematics classroom, you know what is written about that already. That is really, really important. You also know the debates in your field, how different people are debating, the findings, methodological, theoretical choices that are made in the field, and obviously the gaps. And that's where your piece fits in. But you also need to engage in some risk-taking and be a bit rebellious in what you're doing. Radical breakthroughs come from paradigm shifts. Paradigm shifts, that notion of paradigm shifts comes from Thomas Kuhn, who wrote a book called The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. My doctoral supervisor, that was the first book he told me to read. I wasn't doing anything to do with scientific research, but it had a profound impact on me. So if you haven't read it, I really encourage you to. The Structure of Scientific Revolutions by Thomas Kuhn, and Kuhn is spelled K-U-H-N. And Kuhn makes an argument around how paradigm shift, he coined the term paradigm shift, and he makes an argument about how paradigm shifts, how difficult paradigm shifts are to happen in the scientific world, because we're schooled in the methods and the ideas of the particular discipline. But when it happens, it completely moves the field in new directions. And doing so is not easy. Doing so can cause anxiety, fear, maybe these are strong words and maybe you don't want to go there, a lot of humiliation and social shame. You can imagine, sort of how some of these great scientists felt when they came up with new theories and ideas about the Earth circulating the sun and so on and so forth. They were shamed. They were shamed and humiliated. So to make those big breakthroughs is never easy in the work that we do. This is in the wrong place. This slide was supposed to be after the needing organization in your life, which is perfect anyways, because it means that I got all disordered when I was putting them together. I thought this was hilarious. I did make an argument earlier that I was saying that we need to have some order in our life and we need to have stable environments, but we also need to have some flexibility in what we do. And what I love about this picture, and I don't know if you can see it closely enough, that in the chaos of this office, this person, you can't see her face. Maybe we could get a light turned off. Does somebody want to do that over there? She actually looks really happy. It's still not great. She's kind of got a smile on her face in all that chaos. This reminds me of my office at home. Not quite to the same degree, but anyway, we can kind of relate to that. All right. I want to finish with talking about playing. I gave you toys to play with and tinker with. Tinkering. Tinkering means just kind of playing. Look show me your toys. Everybody got some toys? Have you had some fun? Those are all like fun little toys. I hope you'd enjoy seeing those. Creativity, as I mentioned earlier, involves seeing old problems from new angles. And to do that, we need to nurture our curious and creative imaginations in spaces and places we don't normally work and think. There's been a number of people who have researched play researchers. Hammersoe is one, and he wrote, in play, one transcends and surrenders oneself to a make-believe universe in another world in which the participants themselves become someone else. And if you've ever watched children play, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. There is no end purpose to playing. When I sit down with my son to play with our Lego, we just play with it. We don't set up a goal. And we don't stop when we've met that goal, like we do in our research. We're all goal-oriented. And I'm not arguing that we shouldn't have goals at all. But we need time to work, to play with our ideas without having those goals in mind. And when you do that, if you watch children who are really engaged in playing, time is meaningless. And there is nothing else but the moment, being engaged in playing with those toys on their own or with others. And how we do that can be very difficult, but I think it is possible, and I would like to believe it is possible. Others write about the notion of tinkering. A researcher called Taleb explains random tinkering. Tinkering is just sort of, you can imagine a little piece of equipment, and some of you got toys and kind of move them around, Rubik's Cubes and things like that. He writes, we need more tinkering, uninhibited, aggressive, and proud tinkering. We need to make our own luck. We could be scared and worried about the future, or we can look at it as a collection of happy surprises that lie outside the path of our imagination. So here you see a picture of children playing with the Lego. And I love this picture because it just seems that they're unaware of a camera. They're not posing. They're in the moment playing with that Lego. And that, I'd like you all to have Lego moments in your research if you can. I'm not sure how you have Lego moments, but it would be really wonderful. And I'd like to have more Lego moments in my research. But, it's those moments when you're just so engaged in it, you're just completely oblivious to the world around you. And you're not thinking about what time it is. You're not thinking about the next thing you have to do. You're just completely engaged in that moment. Creativity and play. Play is, again, there's play researchers who talk about the idea of play sort of taking us outside of ordinary life. But again, that can be difficult. I encourage you to think about ways that you can engage in more play, in risk-taking, and being a little rebellious with your research. I'm not suggesting that you do away with having goals and expectations. You call them outcomes or whatever you want. But I think about playing in many, many different ways. And if you've ever climbed a tree, again, watching children is a real joy because it helps, I think, to think about the ways that we might go about doing our research. Climbing trees and pushing yourself to new heights. That's playful, that's fun, but it's also about taking risks and pushing the boundaries in a way. And in that respect, I'd like to end with encouraging you to all take some risks in your research, be a little bit more rebellious, play, and have a lot of fun. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. So we have a few minutes for questions with Dr. Larsen.
Sure. Anybody want a new toy?
I have one. It's Marianne. It's actually more of a comment, maybe.
Yeah.
So I'm thinking of the critical justice-oriented researcher, and you talked about the domestication of creativity. And I'm thinking in the context of doctoral work and more broadly in academia. So take, for example, you're looking at a research problem that you consider to be preliminary or even heuristic, or a lot is unknown about it.
Mm-hmm.
And such a research problem is easily aligned with, say, grounded theory, for example. But if we're talking about the domestication of creativity as doctoral students, we're kind of restricted in the use specifically of grounded theory in our research, even though it offers great potential, and more broadly, other theories that aren't considered to be, well, maybe I would say stalwart theories that we can use when we're thinking of doctoral work.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm wondering, how do we navigate that? I understand what you're saying about taking risks and initiative, but we have 4 years.
Yep. Yep.
Sometimes
That's the reality of it.
Yeah, so I'm wondering, how do we juggle that, trying to think of a research problem and trying to align ourselves with specific theories that maybe the faculty or your professor or others are maybe trying to discourage you from using?
If I understand you correctly, are you talking about the fact that there's an expectation when you're writing your proposal to come up with a theoretical framework?
Yes.
And that theoretical framework is supposed to guide your research and be the lens through which you conduct your study, analyze your data. But in choosing that ahead of time, that doesn't enable us to be able to be open to other theories that might be useful in helping us interpret data, especially unanticipated findings. And grounded theory, I'm not sure I would call it a theory, but the grounded approach is that the theory is grounded in the data. It comes out of the data, and that can enable you to develop new theories or contribute to existing theories in new ways, which is creative. And you're right, I don't know how you get around that, because you have those expectations for the proposals, but we never know until we try and push the limits, right? We never know. And there are people who've done that before us, who have done that and pushed back in a way. I experienced it myself. I just got an article back on of reviewers' recommendations, an article that went out to a journal for review, and it was based on grounded theory, right? And then, after we got our research, we turned to a theoretical framework around reciprocity. I won't get into all the details about the study. So then, we get the reviewers' recommendations back, and they say, well, you need to have the theoretical framework first in your paper, and you need to change your research questions to reflect your theoretical framework. Even though those research questions, we didn't have that theoretical framework at all in mind when we began. I wrote this study with Michelle Searle, another professor here, when we started the study. So, we're going to push back, right? Push back a bit. I'm not saying it's easy, but there have been others before us who have done that. There are people who have published doctoral theses that have been books, like fictional books, a piece of narrative writing, and they've done that by pushing back, or stories. I know that there is now some pushback in Indigenous communities from Indigenous scholars that wish to do doctoral theses that engage with storytelling, and they are oral stories that are the sort of product of their research. So we only will be able to do that by engaging in those transgressions in a way. You have to decide what you feel comfortable with. Yep.
It's more so
I'm really grateful of giving the example of playing Lego or, watching kids climb a tree or imagining, because I think that's a very good mental break. As someone in their first year of their master's, and I have some time ahead of me, so I think thank you, that's great.
Yeah, I can't say it enough, but none of my doctoral students believe me. You need to stop your work once in a while. I'm looking at you, Rashid. You're not the only one, so I don't mean to point you out. Eva too, and other students of mine, and Weiwei. Stop working. You're going to be more effective if you stop working, believe it or not. If you stop and take the breaks, if you go and do some exercise, if you go for a walk, watch a movie, just do something completely useless, not related to your research. You will be surprised. You will be surprised about the ideas that come in your mind. I recognize we're running short on time. Do we have time for one more question, or should we end up?
Yeah, I think we have time for one more.
If there is another one or comment, yes?
Dr. Larsen, just to move to the practical.
Yes.
Being an administrator in school, you talked that you were going to touch base on the difference between creativity and innovation. It's a huge push right now.
Oh, yeah.
In the Intensification District School Board. As an educational leader, how do I help teachers and most importantly students develop?
I think that word innovation is equated with the economic ideas of creativity. It's sort of been used to replace the word creativity, and it always is used in the context of the usefulness of being innovative. And again, while we want to encourage our students to be successful, and teachers in schools as well, they need to know also that it's okay to engage in creative processes that might not at first seem like they have a useful end. What that might look
versus process.
Yeah, that's what I would say, definitely. Thanks, that's a good question. So I think, yep.
Can I just make a small little announcement based on, sorry I came in late getting here, but I was part of a group here at the Faculty of Ed, led by Ron Hansen at one time, called the Human Ingenuity Research Group. And I just got an email, timely enough, from Ron
Wow.
this week saying that Marta, I forget her last name now, she's from Norway, and she did a bunch of research with Ron under the auspice of this group. She will be here next week, and they're going to have a meeting of the Human Ingenuity Research Group somewhere around Huron, maybe, on campus here. So if anyone is interested in knowing more, I'll just throw it out about that group. It has been very quiet for a while, but there is a link on the Western Education page about it, and I'll be here all day. I have a poster in the poster session, so if you want to come up and chat about it at all, if you're interested in knowing what the Human Ingenuity Research Group has done and what research they're interested in doing, and maybe your research fits in that, it's along the lines of anything to do with creativity and innovation, that kind of research.
Thank you,
So I'll just throw
Catherine.
it out there
That's
that-
great.
Yeah, timely enough that.
Yeah, that's good to hear.
Yeah, the meeting's probably going to be next week on Wednesday, but yeah.
Well, thank you so much for your talk.
You're
And we're
welcome.
so glad that you were able to join us.